This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Hello, I'm Phil McKinney, and welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where we are all about helping you go from an idea to launching your innovation. Common questions I get via email from listeners of the show is really around just the struggles of how do you actually execute your ideas. Where do you start? The struggles people have, the failure rate at which people trying to take an idea and do something significant and meaningful with it. So today I brought in a specific guest to hopefully that can answer some of those questions, given that I've got my own perspective. But today we brought in Daniel Poser, who's got a book out called 13ers. Why only 13% of companies successfully execute their strategy, and how yours can be one of them. And so therefore, I'm interested in hearing from you, Daniel, just the background on the book. How did this book come about? What prompted you to look into this?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it, especially on your program. It was years ago when I was in my own businesses. I would struggle with my own execution of strategy. We'd come up with a great strategy, and it was, as you know well, most strategies don't get executed. In this case, 87% of companies fail to execute their strategy, and so I looked at that for a long time. And some folks came along and offered to buy my companies, and I was on the street. It was like, what am I going to do next? And I thought, what's the biggest question that really I have, and that is, why are people struggling so hard to execute their strategy? Why is it so damn hard? And why was it so hard for me? And it was during that time that I got introduced to some folks out of Temecula, California, who were doing surveys for the business journals, and it was the best place to work surveys and awards that I got interested in, and they gave me the surveys, and I began to study why I thought, from my perspective, why these companies were doing so well, because best place to work companies do 2 to 3 or greater times better performance on the bottom line.
Yeah, and that's always an interesting question, right? We see all the surveys of best places to work. You look at the Inc. 500 list or the Inc. 1000 list of the fastest growing, and there seems to be kind of this correlation between success and best places to work. What's that linkage? Why do you think that is?
Well, if you look at the Gallup information, they'll tell you that a lot of the reasons why people do so well is because of engagement. And the more I asked about just that one word, engagement, what does that mean to most people? Most people couldn't tell me what engagement is. So when I took these surveys, I had 2 years worth of surveys of companies that actually became best places to work and companies that did not become best places to work. And I went out and interviewed them. And I began looking at what were the comments that people were saying. And it turns out that the same comments, the kind of comments people were making on both sides were very similar. So what I discovered was that it was engagement, but it was deeper than engagement. It was connectedness. It was the ability to connect with each other, connect with a vision, and connect with the leadership of an organization. And that's a series of conversations. That's a network of conversations that literally goes on. Now, Gallup doesn't tell you that, and that's fine. I mean, I like Gallup's work, but I'm really looking at it from more of an ontological perspective. In other words, ontological being the science of human being, the science of being, and I want to know what it is that a company is being. What is it that leaders are being that alter the relationship to the strategy so that the strategy actually does get executed?
And so is it just one conversation, or are there multiple kinds of conversations that you really need to have in order to make that successful?
Well, I found that in looking at first, I found there's 9 conversations. It's like I found these 9 similar conversations. They were the same conversations going on in the non-best place to work as going on in the best place to work. Only the best place to work companies were doing such a much better job at fulfilling on those conversations. And then I discovered there's a 10th one. I was working for a nonprofit doing a pro bono, and they came to me and said, we can't raise money. We're struggling raising money. We can't execute our strategy if we don't raise money. And I began looking at that, and I discovered that the reason was because that they really weren't contributable. Now, this is kind of a funny word because contribution, what does that mean?
Thank you.
Keep going.
So when I began to look at this whole conversation called being contributable, it meant that the people who were engaged in that conversation were open for more than just writing a check to a nonprofit, but actually contributing like a partner, like I'm investing in you as an organization. So that got me thinking, and I began to interview people about and CEOs about why contribution was such an important part. So there's more than one conversation. There's more than 9. There's 10. And those 10 conversations in my book, 13ers, talks about how to manage an organization that is connected.
Well, and I think it's an important part, right? Because I've worked in organizations where the CEO just is, he wants to prove he's the smartest man in the room type of thing versus really being open, right? In an organization.
Exactly.
And I've been in large organizations. Now I'm a CEO for a smaller organization. And the importance, though, of getting everybody, and it's not so much, I don't know, about just contribution, but it's also about buy-in, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's easier to get the buy-in when you allow people to contribute because it's also about ownership.
Exactly.
It's about them being that, taking ownership for not just their contribution, but recognizing that the contribution of the team, and therefore you can elicit organizations that can achieve much higher than any one or small organization where you've got just a single leader and a bunch of followers.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and I think you're a good example of that, actually, Phil, because you understand that, and you understand that that people don't execute strategies that they don't own.
Well, I could tell you one having been, the CTO at Hewlett Packard, 120,000 employees, 178 countries. That's a whole different scale to where now I'm a CEO. Now it's only, it's 210 people. But, you think, okay, if you held a senior leadership role in any large organization that you could just make the step to CEO, it is completely different. It is a completely different beast. And I've had to learn that from that standpoint of your role as being a senior executive versus being the person is something that just totally is transformative from the standpoint of what your role is.
Right.
And the ability to kind of check your ego at the door. So
I think you're right, and I the thing that I think you're hitting on is that one of the biggest things that, and I think it's the first thing I talk about in my book, is that the biggest downfall of CEOs today is that they think they have to know.
Right.
Because if they don't know, then they don't belong in the position. They think they don't belong in the position. But there isn't a CEO out there that knows everything that I've ever met.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, it is about having to admit that, hey, I don't know everything, right? And that look, I came in and became a CEO in an industry that I had no experience in, right? So it's a little bit easier than coming in, everybody's looking to you to be the expert.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's actually been very helpful for me in my transition to a CEO role. So we're going to take a quick commercial break here. And when we come back, we're going to pick up with Dan right where we left off, digging more into his book and the findings, particularly around why 13% of the companies are successful. So we come back, we'll pick that up. If you're interested in staying connected to Killer Innovations, text the word INNOVATE to 33444. I'm Phil McKinney, and you're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network.
BizTalk Radio.
This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
So we're going to pick up this segment with Dan Prozer talking about 13ers, which is his book, talking about why only 13% of companies successfully execute their strategy and how yours can be one of them. So Dan, why don't you pick up where we were talking specifically around what were some of those characteristics of the 13? We talked about engagement as being one in the first segment. So
Right. And so the thing that I did was here I am. I've sold my companies. All my employees are gone. I'm thinking, what am I going to do with my life? And I started getting interested in why these companies are struggling so much. And and a little bit of background, Phil, is that at that time I was on the board of a company or an organization called the Imago Relationship International, and really that's a couplehood. It's like dealing with marriage and couplehood, and I began looking at some of the same dynamics that are being used in couplehood therapy and using them in business. And the thing that I discovered was that, businesses have tended to really be designed around what's called an individual paradigm or an individual value system. And it's an individual value system in which there's tremendous competition and people are out for themselves and people are looking out just for number one. And I'm committed to that there be a shift in the paradigm in business and it be shifted to a relational value system. And so I began looking at what is it that makes up a relational value system, and it really came down to the kind of conversations that go on in business. Business is a conversation. I mean, all day long you're having conversations, you're having different conversations about different things, but nonetheless, business comes down to a conversation, and how well you as a leader manage those conversations will determine the outcome of your business.
So yeah, I mean, and it is very important from the standpoint of how do you get all those elements together. What are some of the other characteristics that you've got in 13ers? You talked a lot about, one topic that I loved out of the book was this whole issue of the execution virus. And it's one of my favorite topics, which I reading the book and seeing how you described it. The term I use is the innovation antibodies.
I love that. That's great.
The people who are in the organization whose sole job is to basically stomp on the idea. And what did you find? One, at least my perspective from the innovation antibodies is everybody has them. Right? It doesn't matter the size of the organization.
It doesn't matter. No. But everybody's got it.
But it's radically different how different organizations respond to it.
Yeah, I love that. Innovation antibodies. Well, so there's a virus that goes on in every organization. And I took it from a little different perspective. I don't have the same depth of innovation background that you do. But what I am looking at this from is this ontological perspective, the science of being. Who are you being as a leader? Who are you being as an organization? And when I look at an organization, I'm looking at what are the conversations that stand in the way of you having what you say that you want in your business. And if you can understand what those conversations are, then you can actually go to the next step and determine who you need to be in order to be the company that you declare yourself to be in the beginning. So the antibodies, the virus that I'm talking about is a meme. Memes are a big word in computing. We've been using them for a long time, but literally we have these viruses, these conversations that run in the back of the organization contextually, and they undermine and they sabotage performance. And when you go into an organization, and as you say, every organization has them. Well, every individual has them as well. And if you understand what's going on, you understand what's really running the show in your business. And if you can understand what's running your show, then what's running the show in your business, then you can actually go in and invent a new place to come from, to counter the virus become the antivirus, and create an organization by declaration. Stand in that as a future and come from it rather than trying to get someplace.
So hold up. You said declaration. What do you mean by that? Give me an example.
Okay, so the first, so in the book, there's a process called the Breakthrough Solution Framework. Breakthrough Solution Framework really comes down to three basic steps. The first step is declaring an impossible outcome, something that is so impossible that you can't imagine how it would be possible to actually accomplish that. And then, as I said, you've got to understand what the conversation is, or the virus that's in the organization, that the conversation that undermines and sabotages. And then you have to come up with, who do you need to be in order for you to have what you say that you want? So the big thing is, what kind of an outcome do you want? And frankly, it's by declaration. Our country was declared into existence. So anything that is worth having is declared into existence. I can't imagine there's one thing that you have innovated, that you've created, that you didn't first think in your head and speak out of your mouth.
Well, I think in the case of the innovation game, what we typically say is that, thinking it or even just writing it down is not all that valuable. It's the ability to actually translate that from the standpoint of being able to declare it. And I didn't use the word declare, but it was really about communicating it to others to help transmit the knowledge in that. So let's pick that up when we come back from this commercial break. Got to pay a few bills. Stay right where you're at. We're going to be right back with Dan on more about his book, 13ers. If you want to stay connected with everything going on here at Killer Innovations, text the word innovate to 33444 or visit killerinnovations.com/innovate. We're going to be right back after this commercial break with more with Dan, talking more about how you can actually take that strategy and be successful. I'm Phil McKinney. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network.
BizTalk Radio.
This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome back to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We're picking up in this segment, continuing our discussion with Dan Prosser on the 13% of companies really successfully execute their strategy based on his book, 13ers. Now, as we were ending the last segment, we were talking about being, declaring or be declarative in the form of what it is your strategy is, or whatever, in the case of me, what the innovation is. And as I was sharing, as we were going through the commercial break, I recognize that I do that, but I've never used that term. And now that I'm sitting here thinking about it, I'm not quite sure how I do it. I just do it.
You're just that good?
I don't know if I'm that good. I think it's just... I tend to think out loud. I tend to try to declare as a way of setting a vision or setting a strategy that the rest of the team can rally around.
Yes, most people can't do that.
So tell me what I'm doing, because I can't reverse engineer what I do.
Okay, so there's a really great story that I picked up back in 2004. Most people know that we're here in Colorado, and I live up in the mountains where the resorts are. And in fact, they just opened up last week. Practically all, I guess they all opened up. We've got snow, and I'm not just plugging Colorado, but back in 2004, Keystone Resort, the ski resort Keystone, opened their winter season with a contest, a competition called the 36-Hour Team Challenge. And in this Team Challenge, there were about 80 teams that were competing for $3,600. So all these teams got together, and they started out the 36-hour team challenge, and they went overnight, and they kept going all night long. And some of them were snowboarders, some of them were skiers. At the end of the 36-hour team challenge, and it's interesting because my neighbors were at this and were part of the awards ceremony. They gave the third place award, and then they gave the second place award, and then came time for them to announce the first place award. And so they came up, they got up there, and they said, okay, now the winner of the $3,600 in the 36-hour team challenge is the team that just won $3,600. And everybody stopped, and it was like silence, and they said, well, what was the name of the team? And they said, the name of the team is the team that just won $3,600. They said, what kind of a name is that for a team? Well, what these two guys by the name, and I hope you're out there listening to me, you guys, Bill Pomeroy and Nick Gearhart, had gotten together several weeks before the competition, and they had put their names in for the competition, and they put their name of their team down, the team that just won $3,600. Now, they didn't say the team that was going to win $3,600. They didn't say. They said the team that just won, as if they already declared the future as if it had just happened. And I would suspect, Phil, that you do this frequently. Okay? So you're literally inventing a conversation not about how to get to the future, but how to literally stand in that future, coming from that future, and then close the gap between where you are and where you are in reality. Let's put it that way. And then where you say you want to be. So if you're the team that just won $3,600, you are going to literally have to take the actions necessary to close the gap between where you say you are as a future and where you literally are in reality currently. So I've used this story with my clients for years because I think it's one of the most powerful lessons for an organization to learn, to be able to declare a future that doesn't exist, that looks impossible. In fact, what if they lost? Can you imagine what their friends would have said to them? I mean, they took a big risk. And you do this too. I do this. People who are creating futures literally declare those futures, and they declare them as if they exist right now. Stand in them and then ask, how did I get here? Not stand in the current and look at this possible future and ask yourself, how am I going to get there? And what steps am I going to take? Like you're going to climb a ladder. But literally stand in that future as if it's already occurred and ask yourself, how did I get here? What was missing that got me here?
Well, in the case of the innovation game, what some people will refer to that as is reverse road mapping. So we have our
a new tilt.
You got to give you the new buzzwords, man. You got to new terms. But the fact in the innovation game, right? We all focus on roadmaps. Day zero plus 90, day zero plus 180. What's the plan to get to delivering the product? In the case of future casting, when you're trying to figure out what the future is really all about, it's about, like you said, standing in the future and looking backwards.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different ways to do it. You just declared it. Like I said, I've never thought about it that way, but now that you've described it, it's kind of like, okay, it makes sense. In some cases, like one of the things we did at HP was we would create these future videos. So we would actually project out sometime into the future, given trend lines of what we saw certain technologies, and we would actually create that future in the form of a short film. So 3 to 5 minutes, very high production value, basically to get the viewer to suspend disbelief that the future would or would not happen. One of them is one called Roku. Now this one was done in 2006, and it's not Roku the box that gives you video streaming to your TV. It's ROKU. You can search for it on YouTube, or you can go to my YouTube channel, Phil McKinney, and you'll find it there. And it's about an augmented reality game in San Francisco. And I literally still get hundreds of emails off that video for people wanting to know where to buy the game. And the game's never existed. And in fact, a lot of the AR companies in Silicon Valley show that video to kind of paint what the potential for augmented reality is in the future for gameplay. But it's and that was 2006, right? So we're 9 years in the future, and that vision still resonates with people, even over that time frame. But it is important because otherwise, when you're standing here, we tend as humans to think linearly, whereas things like technology progress exponentially. And humans have a very hard time thinking exponentially,
Right.
from the context of what is the future going to really be. It's actually easier to stand there, paint them a story, and look back, because then they project themselves into that future. And what you're talking about, I just never have thought about it in that way, and that is exactly behind the scenes what people do when they try to paint that future, is to declare it.
Well, I can tell you that when you do that, and obviously, I mean, what you're saying is this is what people want. I mean, if people are seeing this still today and still emailing you about this, what is it, 10 years later almost?
Yeah, 9 years, coming up on 10.
Yeah. So this is what, I mean, I don't want to go into this into this in depth because we don't have the time, but, this is a reverse salient. This is what is holding people back, is that they cannot envision standing themselves in the future and being able to look back. But when they do, as you know, that is what creates the possibility and the big companies.
So as we're coming down to the end of this segment, Dan, I'm interested. Entrepreneurs, what's the one thing that a listener could think can do differently that would have the biggest impact on their ability to get the execution right?
Okay, well, if I'm talking to a CEO, for example, the first conversation I want to have with a CEO is to stop trying to manage people and start managing promises. So I want to bring accountability into organizations in a relational way, not in a way in which you use accountability to punish people or demand things from people, but it's a relational concept. It's a relational value system, accountability, where instead of managing the people and telling them what to do and getting on their case, then to actually manage the promises, elicit promise. And that becomes the promise-based management system that I talk about in the book.
Great. So, Dan, if people want to follow you, where's the best place they can find you?
Well, the best place to go right now is 13ersbook.com.
And we'll include that link in the show notes. So listeners just go to Killer Innovations. We'll have that link.
And if you go to 13ersbook.com, I'll give you a book for shipping and handling.
Oh, wow.
I'll sign it.
That's great.
And I'll send it to you.
Okay, perfect. We'll put that into the show notes. Dan, really appreciate you taking the time, coming down here.
Thank you, Phil. It's
appreciate it. Stay tuned. We've got a killer question to really stretch your mind. We're going to exercise that creative muscle, so don't go anywhere. So when we come right back, we'll jump into the question. I'm Phil McKinney. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network.
The opinions you hear on Biz Talk Radio are those of the hosts, callers, and guests, and do not necessarily reflect those of this station, Biz Talk Radio, its management, or advertisers. The information on Biz Talk Radio does not constitute a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any product or service. If you have any questions about Biz Talk Radio, contact us at 817-274-1609 or at biztalkradio.com. Biz Talk Radio.